Hey everyone, welcome back to another dive into the absolute chaos that is human behavior. Tonight, we're exploring some seriously wild Reddit confessions that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about the people in your life. I've got workplace sabotage, family secrets that destroyed decades of relationships, romantic betrayals that would make soap opera writers jealous, and personal revelations that probably should have stayed buried forever. So, grab your favorite beverage and let's jump straight into tonight's collection of human disasters. This first story proves that sometimes the person you trust most is the one planning your downfall from day one. I never thought I'd be writing this, but I need to get it off my chest because it's been eating me alive for months. My name is Marcus, and I'm 33 years old. Until 6 months ago, I thought I had the perfect business partnership and friendship with someone I'd known since college. I met Danny during our sophomore year at State University. We were both business majors, both ambitious, both dreaming of starting our own company someday. We spent countless nights in the library, not just studying, but planning our future empire. Danny was the kind of guy who could sell ice to an Eskimo, charismatic and convincing in a way that made everyone want to be around him. I was more of the numbers guy, detail-oriented and methodical. We seemed like the perfect complement to each other. After graduation, we both worked at different companies for about 5 years, gaining experience and saving money. We stayed in touch, always talking about our eventual business venture. Finally, in 2021, we decided to take the plunge. We pooled our savings, about $40,000 each, and started a digital marketing consultancy focused on small businesses in our area. For the first 2 years, everything seemed perfect. Danny handled client relationships and sales, while I managed operations and finances. We were growing steadily, landing bigger clients, building a solid reputation. Our revenue went from nothing to nearly $200,000 annually. We were finally living the dream we'd talked about in college. Danny was everything I could have wanted in a business partner. He was dedicated, working late nights and weekends. He brought in great clients and always seemed to know exactly what they needed to hear. Our clients loved him, and several specifically mentioned that they chose our company because of Danny's presentations and proposals. But looking back now, there were signs I should have noticed. Danny was always the one who handled initial client meetings alone, claiming it was more efficient than both of us being there. He managed most of the client communications, saying his sales background made him better suited for maintaining those relationships. And he insisted on being the primary contact for our biggest clients, explaining that consistency was important for client satisfaction. I trusted him completely, so I didn't question any of these arrangements. I was happy focusing on the back-end work while Danny handled the client-facing responsibilities. It seemed like a natural division of labor based on our different skill sets. The first crack in my trust came during a conversation with one of our biggest clients, Sarah, who owned a chain of boutique fitness studios. I ran into her at a coffee shop in March, and she mentioned how excited she was about the new direction Danny had proposed for their social media strategy. When I asked for more details, she described a campaign that sounded nothing like what Danny had told me we were implementing for her account. I assumed there had been some miscommunication, so I casually brought it up with Danny later that day. His explanation seemed reasonable at the time. He said he'd had to pivot quickly based on Sarah's feedback and hadn't had a chance to update me on the changes. But something about his response felt off, like he was being more defensive than the situation warranted. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to our client communications and project details. What I discovered made my stomach drop. Danny had been systematically lying to me about client requirements, project scopes, and even billing arrangements. The Sarah situation was just the tip of the iceberg. Danny had been telling clients that certain premium services were included in their packages while billing them for basic services. He'd been promising deliverables that we weren't actually providing, then covering for the gaps with explanations about strategy changes or market conditions. But the real betrayal was what I found when I started digging deeper into our financial records. Danny had been skimming money from client payments for months, maybe longer. He'd set up a separate business account that I didn't know about and had been diverting portions of client payments before they ever reached our main business account. The system was sophisticated and well planned. Danny would quote clients a certain price, but then process their payments through his separate account, taking his cut before transferring the remainder to our business account as if it were the full payment. Since I wasn't involved in the payment processing, I never saw the discrepancy. When I confronted Danny with the evidence, his reaction told me everything I needed to know. He didn't deny it, didn't act surprised, didn't even seem particularly upset about being caught. Instead, he got angry at me for snooping and accused me of not trusting him. The conversation that followed was surreal. Danny explained that he'd been taking what he called a sales commission on top of our agreed profit split because he was doing all the client acquisition work. He claimed this was standard practice in sales-heavy businesses and acted like I was naive for not expecting it. When I pointed out that this meant he'd been stealing from both me and our clients, Danny's response was even more shocking. He said he'd always planned to tell me about the arrangement once our business was more established. He'd been protecting me from the complexity of commission-based compensation structures. The audacity was breathtaking. Danny had systematically defrauded our clients and embezzled from our partnership for over a year, then tried to frame it as a reasonable business practice that he'd planned to explain to me eventually. As I dug deeper, I realized the extent of Danny's deception went far beyond skimming payments. He'd been using our business credit line for personal expenses, charging personal meals and entertainment to client accounts, and even billing clients for work that was never completed. The financial damage was devastating. Danny had stolen approximately $35,000 over the course of 14 months, but the relationship damage was worse. I'd trusted this person with my financial future, my professional reputation, and my friendship, and he'd been systematically betraying that trust from almost the beginning of our partnership. The legal battle that followed was messy and expensive. Danny hired a lawyer and tried to argue that his actions were legitimate business practices that I'd implicitly agreed to by not monitoring the finances more closely. His lawyer painted me as a passive partner who'd abdicated responsibility for the business operations and was now trying to blame Danny for natural business expenses. Ultimately, we settled out of court. Danny agreed to pay back $22,000 of what he'd taken and signed over his shares in the business to me. But the legal fees and lost clients from the scandal ate up most of the recovery, and I was left with a damaged business and a destroyed friendship. The hardest part wasn't even the financial loss. It was realizing that someone I'd considered my best friend had been planning to rob me from the very beginning. Danny's betrayal wasn't impulsive or accidental. It was calculated and systematic, executed by someone who could look me in the eye every day while stealing from me and our clients. I've since rebuilt the business as a solo operation. It's smaller than what Danny and I had together, but it's honest and sustainable. I've learned to handle both the sales and operational sides, and while I miss the partnership dynamic, I sleep better at night knowing I can trust the person running my business. Danny and I haven't spoken since the settlement. I heard through mutual friends that he started another business in a different city, and I sometimes wonder if he's running the same scams on a new set of partners and clients. I hope not, but I've learned that some people are just wired differently when it comes to honesty and loyalty. The experience taught me that trust in business, like any relationship, should be verified with systems and transparency. No matter how much you care about someone, no matter how long you've known them, financial partnerships require checks and balances that protect both parties from temptation and misunderstanding. These days, I'm more careful about who I trust with my livelihood, and while I'm open to partnerships in the future, I'll never again assume that friendship and business integrity are the same thing. Sometimes, the people closest to us are the ones most capable of devastating betrayal. That's the end of that story. Imagine discovering that your business partner and best friend had been systematically stealing from you for over a year while looking you in the eye every day. This next story shows how family secrets can destroy relationships that took decades to build. My name is Lisa, and I'm 41 years old. 6 months ago, I discovered something about my family that's changed everything I thought I knew about my childhood, my parents, and my relationship with my siblings. It's the kind of revelation that makes you question every memory and every assumption you've built your life on. I grew up in what I thought was a typical middle-class family in suburban Cleveland. My parents, Robert and Patricia, were both teachers. My dad taught high school history, and my mom was an elementary school librarian. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We took family vacations every summer, usually camping trips or visits to see relatives. My parents were careful with money, but never seemed to struggle financially. I have 2 siblings, my older brother Michael, who's 44, and my younger sister Jessica, who's 38. We were a close family growing up, the kind where Sunday dinners were mandatory and everyone came home for holidays. My parents were supportive and involved, attending our school events and helping with homework. From the outside, we probably looked like the perfect American family. The first hint that something was wrong came last fall when my father had a minor heart attack. Nothing life-threatening, but scary enough that my parents decided it was time to get their affairs in order. They asked me to help them organize their important documents and update their wills. I spent a weekend at their house, going through decades of paperwork, bank statements, insurance policies, and tax returns. My parents are meticulous record keepers, so everything was well organized and clearly labeled. But as I worked through the files, I started noticing financial patterns that didn't make sense. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, there were regular deposits to my parents' savings account that seemed too large for their teaching salaries. These weren't occasional bonuses or tax refunds, but consistent monthly deposits of $800 to $1,200 that appeared alongside their regular paychecks. When I asked my parents about these deposits, they got evasive in a way that was completely unlike them. They claimed the money was from tutoring and substitute teaching work, but the amounts were too regular and too substantial for that explanation to make sense. My curiosity was piqued, so I dug deeper into their financial records. What I found changed everything I thought I knew about my family's history. Hidden in a folder labeled Investment Records were documents related to a trust fund that had been established in 1978, the year before I was born. The trust was funded with an initial deposit of $200,000, an enormous sum for that time, especially for a young couple just starting their teaching careers. The trust documents revealed that the money had come from my paternal grandfather, William, who I'd been told had died when I was very young. According to family stories I'd grown up hearing, Grandpa William had been a factory worker who lived modestly and left very little when he passed away. But the trust documents told a completely different story. William had apparently been involved in some kind of business that generated substantial wealth, and he'd left a significant inheritance to his son, my father, with specific instructions about how the money should be used and when it should be disclosed to the family. The trust had been designed to provide monthly payments to supplement my parents' income, with the principal remaining untouched until my father reached age 65. The payments were what I'd been seeing in their bank records, the mysterious deposits that had helped fund our comfortable childhood. But the most shocking part was a letter from my grandfather, dated 1978, that explained the source of the money and why it needed to be kept secret. William had been involved in bootlegging during Prohibition and had invested the profits in real estate and legitimate businesses over the decades. By the time he died, his illegal activities from the 1920s had generated a substantial fortune. The letter explained that William was concerned about the stigma and potential legal complications that might arise if the family's wealth was traced back to its illegal origins. He instructed my father to never discuss the source of the money and to let the family believe they were living on teaching salaries alone. I sat in my parents' kitchen reading this letter, trying to process what it meant. Our entire family narrative was built on a lie. We'd grown up believing we were the children of hard-working teachers, who provided for us through dedication and careful budgeting. The reality was that we were trust fund kids, whose comfortable lifestyle was funded by Prohibition-era bootlegging profits. When I confronted my parents with the documents, they finally told me the whole truth. My father had known about the inheritance from the beginning, but had promised his father he would never discuss it with anyone, including his own wife. My mother had learned about it when they were updating their wills after getting married, and they'd agreed together to maintain the secret. For over 40 years, my parents had been living off this hidden inheritance while letting their children believe they were witnessing the rewards of hard work and modest living. Every lesson they'd taught us about money, every conversation about budgeting and saving, every story about making sacrifices for the family, all of it had been built on a foundation of deception. The revelation explained so many things that had never made sense about our childhood. How we could afford family vacations on teachers' salaries. How my parents had been able to help all three of us with college expenses without taking out loans. How they'd managed to own their home outright by the time they were in their 40s. But it also raised disturbing questions about honesty and family loyalty. My parents had looked their children in the eye for decades and lied about fundamental aspects of our family's financial reality. They'd used money from illegal activities to fund our upbringing while teaching us about integrity and following the law. When I told my siblings about the discovery, their reactions were as shocked as mine had been. Michael was angry about the deception, but seemed more focused on the practical implications for inheritance and taxes. Jessica was devastated by the revelation that our grandfather, who she'd always idealized based on family stories, had been a criminal. The family dynamics have been strained ever since. Michael thinks we should be grateful that our grandfather's illegal activities ultimately benefited us, and that our parents were just trying to protect us from unnecessary stigma. Jessica feels betrayed by the decades of lies and questions whether she can trust anything our parents have told us about our family history. I'm somewhere in between. I understand why my grandfather wanted to protect his family from the consequences of his past, and I can see why my parents felt bound by their promise to maintain his secret. But I also feel like I've been living a lie my entire life, making decisions and forming values based on a completely false understanding of our family's circumstances. The financial implications are complicated too. My parents are now in their 70s, and the trust fund that supported our family for decades is nearly depleted. They're facing retirement with limited savings beyond their teacher pensions, and there's an uncomfortable irony in the fact that the illegal money that funded our comfortable childhood won't be available to support them in their old age. We've had several family meetings to discuss how to handle this revelation going forward. My parents want us to continue keeping the secret, arguing that there's no benefit to exposing our grandfather's illegal activities decades after his death. But Jessica and I feel like the secret keeping has already done enough damage to our family relationships. I've been seeing a therapist to work through the emotional impact of learning that my entire understanding of my family was based on deception. It's strange to mourn the loss of a family narrative that was never true in the first place, but that's what it feels like. Grief for the simple, honest family story I thought I belonged to. The hardest part is figuring out how to move forward with my parents. I love them, and I'm grateful for the comfortable childhood they provided, but I'm struggling to rebuild trust after such a fundamental deception. How do you forgive people for lying to you your entire life, even when their motives were protective rather than malicious? I don't know if our family will ever fully recover from this revelation. The secret that was supposed to protect us has ended up creating division and mistrust that might be irreparable. Sometimes, I wonder if ignorance really would have been bliss in this case. But I've also learned something important about the stories we tell ourselves about our families and our past. The comfortable narratives we build about who we are and where we came from are often more fragile than we realize. And sometimes the truth, however uncomfortable, is necessary for genuine relationships to exist. That's the end of that story. Discovering that your entire childhood was funded by illegal money while being taught about honesty and integrity is the kind of revelation that changes everything. This next story shows how a small lie can spiral into relationship-destroying deception. My name is Amanda, and I'm 29 years old. What started as a tiny white lie to avoid an awkward conversation has snowballed into the most complicated and embarrassing situation of my adult life. It's been 7 months since this whole mess began, and I'm still dealing with the fallout from what I thought would be a harmless little deception. I work as a marketing assistant for a non-profit organisation in Portland. It's meaningful work, but the pay is pretty modest, about $38,000 a year. I live in a small studio apartment, drive a used car that's older than some of my co-workers, and generally live paycheck to paycheck, like most people my age in expensive cities. The trouble started last spring when I matched with someone on a dating app. His name was Ryan, and he seemed perfect on paper, handsome, funny, successful, and genuinely interested in getting to know me. Ryan worked in tech, made good money, and lived in one of those trendy downtown lofts that I'd only seen in magazines. Our first few dates went amazingly well. Ryan was charming and thoughtful, the kind of guy who remembered details from previous conversations and planned creative dates that didn't revolve around expensive restaurants. I was already imagining introducing him to my friends and family. But there was one issue that kept nagging at me. Ryan's lifestyle was clearly several income brackets above mine. His casual clothes cost more than my entire wardrobe. He drove a car that was worth more than I made in a year. His apartment was featured in a local design magazine, and while he never made me feel bad about our financial differences, I started feeling insecure about the gap between our circumstances. The problem came to a head during our 4th date, when Ryan suggested we take a weekend trip to Seattle to visit some of his friends. He offered to pay for everything, explaining that he had hotel points and airline miles from business travel. It was a generous offer, but it made me acutely aware of how unequal our financial situations were. During dinner that night, Ryan started talking about his work stress and mentioned how he sometimes envied people with less demanding careers who could focus on work-life balance instead of constantly chasing higher salaries and promotions. He said something about how refreshing it was to date someone who wasn't obsessed with money and status. That's when I made the decision that would haunt me for months to come. Instead of being honest about my financial situation, I told Ryan that I was actually taking a career break to focus on personal projects, and that I had some family money that allowed me to pursue non-profit work without worrying about salary. It was a stupid lie, but it felt like a solution to my insecurity in the moment. Instead of being the struggling non-profit worker dating above her income level, I became the privileged do-gooder who chose meaningful work over financial gain. The lie made me feel more like Ryan's equal and less like a charity case. Ryan's reaction was everything I'd hoped for. He seemed impressed by my values-driven approach to career decisions and my family's apparent financial security. He started talking about how rare it was to meet someone who understood that money wasn't everything, and how attractive he found my independence from financial pressures. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly the lie would need to grow to remain believable. Ryan started asking casual questions about my family, my background, my education, all innocent conversation that required increasingly elaborate fabrications to maintain my fictional financial security. I found myself inventing stories about a trust fund from my grandmother, private school education that I'd actually never had, and family connections in various professional fields. Each lie required 3 more lies to support it, and within weeks I was maintaining an entirely fictional personal history. The worst part was how good Ryan was to me based on his false understanding of my situation. He'd suggest expensive activities and then backtrack when he remembered that I'd supposedly chosen a lower-paying job by choice rather than necessity. He'd make comments about how admirable it was that I was living authentically instead of chasing wealth like so many people our age. Ryan's respect for my imaginary principles made me feel terrible about deceiving him, but I was in too deep to come clean without destroying what had become a serious relationship. By month 3, we were talking about moving in together. By month 4, Ryan was introducing me to his family as someone who shared his values about money and success. The situation became increasingly stressful as Ryan and I grew closer. I had to be careful about what restaurants I suggested, what activities I proposed, what stories I told about my past. I was constantly worried about being exposed by some inconsistency in my fabricated background. The near-miss exposures were frequent and terrifying. Ryan once suggested we drive by the private school I'd supposedly attended, and I had to make up an excuse about not wanting to revisit painful memories from that time. He offered to invest some of my imaginary trust fund money through his financial advisor, and I had to claim that family legal complications made that impossible. I started avoiding situations where my real financial situation might become obvious. I made excuses to avoid meeting my co-workers when Ryan wanted to attend non-profit events. I declined invitations to hang out with my friends when Ryan was around, worried that they might inadvertently reveal my actual circumstances. The deception was exhausting and isolating. I was living a double life, maintaining one identity with Ryan and another identity with everyone else in my life. I couldn't fully relax in either world because I was always worried about maintaining the boundaries between my real life and my fictional one. The beginning of the end came when Ryan started making serious plans based on his false understanding of my financial situation. He suggested that we take a 2-week vacation to Europe for his birthday, assuming that I could afford to split the costs. He talked about us eventually buying a house together, factoring in my imaginary trust fund as part of our joint financial planning. When I realized that Ryan was making major life decisions based on my lies, I knew I had to come clean. But by then, we'd been together for almost 6 months, and the deception felt too big and too fundamental to survive honest disclosure. I tried several times to find a way to tell Ryan the truth without destroying our relationship. I considered gradually revealing financial difficulties that would explain away my trust fund. I thought about claiming that my family had lost money in the stock market or bad investments, but every approach I considered involved additional lies, and I was already drowning in the complexity of maintaining my fictional identity. The truth came out in the worst possible way. Ryan surprised me by showing up at my apartment, unannounced one evening, with flowers and takeout from an expensive restaurant. He'd never been to my place before. I'd always made excuses about renovations or visiting roommates to avoid having him see my modest studio and second-hand furniture. Ryan's reaction to my living situation told me everything I needed to know. He looked around my tiny apartment with obvious confusion, taking in my thrift store furniture, my ancient appliances, my general lack of anything that would indicate family wealth or financial security. When he asked about the disconnect between my supposed financial situation and my living arrangements, I finally broke down and confessed everything. I told him about the lie I'd told on our 4th date, about how it had grown and expanded, about how I'd been maintaining a completely fictional identity for months. Ryan's response was worse than anger. It was disappointment and betrayal. He couldn't understand how someone he'd grown to care about could lie to him so consistently and extensively. He felt like he'd been in a relationship with a fictional person rather than the real me. The conversation that followed was brutal. Ryan pointed out that he'd shared intimate details about his life, his family, his fears and insecurities, while I'd been feeding him lies about fundamental aspects of my identity. He felt manipulated and questioned whether anything about our relationship had been genuine. I tried to explain that everything except the financial lies had been real: my feelings for him, my personality, my values, my interest in his life and career. But Ryan couldn't separate the person he'd fallen for from the deception I'd used to create that person. We broke up that night, and I haven't heard from Ryan since. I spent weeks crafting apology texts and emails that I never sent, knowing that no explanation could undo months of systematic deception. The aftermath has been devastating in ways I never anticipated. I lost someone I genuinely cared about because I was too insecure to be honest about who I really was. But I also lost respect for myself, realizing that I'd been so uncomfortable with my own circumstances that I'd created an entirely different identity to escape them. I've been working with a therapist to understand why I felt like my real life wasn't good enough to share with someone I wanted to build a relationship with. The experience taught me that insecurity and shame about my financial situation were bigger problems than the actual financial limitations themselves. I've also learned that lies in relationships don't stay small. What felt like a minor exaggeration to avoid embarrassment grew into a massive deception that poisoned everything good about our connection. The cover-up really was worse than the crime. These days, I'm trying to build a life I'm proud to share with someone else. I'm working on advancing my career, improving my financial situation, and most importantly, accepting that someone who can't appreciate me as I actually am isn't the right person for me anyway. I still think about Ryan sometimes and wonder if we could have had something real if I'd been brave enough to be honest from the beginning, but I'll never know, and that's the price I pay for choosing deception over vulnerability. That's the end of that story. Creating a completely fictional identity to impress someone you're dating is the kind of lie that can never end well. This next story proves that sometimes your biggest supporter is actually your worst enemy in disguise. My name is Sarah, and I'm 32 years old. For nearly a decade, I thought I had the most supportive best friend anyone could ask for. Someone who celebrated my victories, comforted me through defeats, and always seemed to have my best interests at heart. It took me 8 years to realize that this person had been systematically sabotaging my life while positioning herself as my greatest advocate. I met Christine during graduate school at Northwestern. We were both in the communications program, both ambitious and driven, both determined to build successful careers in public relations. Christine was the kind of person who seemed to effortlessly excel at everything. She was beautiful, articulate, well-connected, and had that natural charisma that made professors and classmates gravitate toward her. From our first semester, Christine took me under her wing. She'd invite me to study groups with the top students, introduce me to professors at department events, and share opportunities she heard about through her extensive network. I felt incredibly lucky to have found such a generous friend who was willing to help me navigate the competitive world of graduate school. Christine and I became inseparable. We'd work on projects together, attend industry events as a team, and spend hours discussing our career goals and strategies. Christine seemed genuinely invested in my success, often staying up late to help me refine presentations or practice for important meetings with potential mentors. After graduation, we both moved to Chicago and landed entry-level positions at different PR firms. Christine got hired at one of the most prestigious agencies in the city, while I started at a smaller, lesser-known company. Christine assured me that this was actually better for my career development. I'd get more hands-on experience at a smaller firm and could use that foundation to eventually move to a bigger agency. For the first few years, our careers seemed to progress in parallel. We'd meet for drinks every Friday to discuss our work, share industry gossip, and strategize about our next career moves. Christine was always encouraging, always optimistic about my prospects, always willing to make introductions or recommend me for opportunities. But looking back now, I can see the subtle ways Christine was positioning herself ahead of me while maintaining the appearance of being my supportive friend. She'd volunteer to be my representative at industry events when I couldn't attend, then come back with stories about how she'd promoted my work to important contacts. She'd offer to submit my portfolio for opportunities alongside her own, then report back that, unfortunately, they'd chosen to go with someone else, but that my work had been highly regarded. The pattern continued as we both advanced in our careers. Christine moved to increasingly prestigious positions, while I seemed to consistently fall just short of major opportunities. I'd make it to final rounds of interviews for dream jobs, only to lose out to candidates who, according to Christine's inside information, had been predetermined choices from the beginning. Christine was always there to comfort me after these disappointments, reassuring me that my time would come and that these setbacks were just preparing me for something even better. She'd take me out for expensive dinners after particularly crushing rejections, reminding me that success in our industry required patience and persistence. What I didn't realize was that Christine had been actively working against me behind the scenes. She'd built a reputation as someone with excellent judgment about talent, and she was using that credibility to quietly undermine my prospects while publicly supporting me. The first real hint of Christine's betrayal came 3 years ago when I was being considered for a senior account manager position at a major agency. The interview process had gone incredibly well, better than any job interview I'd ever had. The hiring manager seemed genuinely excited about my experience and ideas, and I left feeling confident that I'd finally landed the breakthrough opportunity I'd been working toward. Christine was thrilled when I told her about the interview. She congratulated me repeatedly and insisted that we celebrate in advance because she was certain I'd get the job. She even offered to use her industry connections to put in a good word for me with people who might have influence over the hiring decision. 2 weeks later, I received a rejection email that was surprisingly cold and impersonal given how well the interviews had gone. When I called the hiring manager to ask for feedback, she seemed uncomfortable and evasive, mentioning vague concerns about my cultural fit and long-term commitment that hadn't come up during our conversations. I was devastated, and Christine was appropriately sympathetic. She took me out for drinks and helped me analyze what might have gone wrong, offering theories about office politics and industry bias that made me feel better about the rejection. She assured me that something even better would come along soon. What I didn't know was that Christine had indeed used her connections to influence the hiring decision, FAF, but not in my favor. Through a mutual contact, she'd planted seeds of doubt about my reliability and professionalism, suggesting that I had a pattern of jumping between jobs when things got challenging and that I might not be ready for the responsibility of a senior role. The revelation of Christine's betrayal came by pure accident last spring. I was at an industry conference, waiting in line for coffee, when I overheard a conversation between 2 women behind me. One of them was discussing a candidate they'd recently rejected for a position, mentioning how a respected industry contact had raised concerns about the candidate's stability and work ethic. As I listened to the details, I realized they were talking about the job I'd lost 3 years earlier, and the respected industry contact they mentioned was clearly Christine, based on the specific concerns that had been raised and the timing of the conversations. I turned around and politely introduced myself, explaining that I thought they might be discussing a position I'd interviewed for. After some initial awkwardness, one of the women confirmed that Christine had indeed contacted them about my application, expressing concern that I might not be the right fit for their company culture. The woman seemed surprised when I told her that Christine was supposedly my best friend who had offered to put in a good word for me. She mentioned that Christine had presented herself as someone who knew me professionally and was concerned about potential red flags that the hiring committee might have missed. That conversation changed everything. I realized that Christine hadn't been the supportive friend I thought she was. She'd been actively sabotaging my career while maintaining the pretense of being my advocate. Every rejection, every near miss, every disappointing outcome that Christine had helped me process might have been the result of her behind-the-scenes interference. I spent the next several weeks quietly investigating Christine's role in other career setbacks I'd experienced over the years. Through careful conversations with mutual contacts and former colleagues, I discovered a pattern of behavior that was both sophisticated and devastating. Number 8. Christine had been systematically undermining me for nearly 8 years. She'd volunteer to make introductions on my behalf, then use those conversations to plant doubts about my qualifications or character. She'd offer to submit my work for opportunities, then either fail to follow through or include subtle warnings about my supposed limitations. The most heartbreaking discovery was learning that Christine had convinced several potential mentors and collaborators that I was unreliable and difficult to work with. People I'd hoped to build relationships with had been warned away from me by someone they trusted and respected. Christine's sabotage wasn't limited to professional opportunities. I learned that she'd also interfered in my personal relationships, sharing confidential information with mutual friends and romantic interests in ways that damaged my reputation and isolated me from potential support networks. The sophistication of Christine's manipulation was staggering. She'd create problems, then position herself as the solution. She'd damage my relationships with others, then comfort me when those relationships failed. She'd undermine my confidence through subtle criticism, disguised as helpful feedback, then build me back up with encouragement that kept me dependent on her validation. When I finally confronted Christine with what I'd discovered, her reaction was unlike anything I'd expected. Instead of denial or apology, she seemed almost relieved that the truth was finally out. She admitted to everything with a matter-of-fact attitude that was more chilling than any emotional outburst would have been. Christine explained that she'd never intended for our friendship to become so complicated, but that she'd felt threatened by my potential from the moment we met in graduate school. She'd convinced herself that our industry was too competitive for both of us to succeed, and that helping me fail was just protecting her own interests. What disturbed me most was Christine's genuine belief that her behavior had been justified. She claimed that I would have done the same thing if our positions had been reversed, and that this kind of strategic maneuvering was just part of professional success in a competitive field. Christine also revealed that she'd been struggling with her own insecurities about her career, despite her apparent success. She'd been promoted quickly, but felt like an imposter, and undermining me had been a way to convince herself that she deserved the opportunities she'd been given. The conversation was surreal and devastating. This person, who I'd trusted with my deepest fears and biggest dreams, had been systematically destroying my life for nearly a decade while presenting herself as my most loyal friend. Every moment of support, every word of encouragement, every gesture of friendship had been calculated manipulation designed to keep me dependent on her while ensuring I never became a threat to her success. The aftermath of discovering Christine's betrayal has been complicated and painful. I had to rebuild my professional reputation from scratch, reaching out to contacts who might have been poisoned against me and working to undo years of damage to my career prospects. More challenging has been learning to trust my own judgment again. Christine's manipulation was so subtle and long-term that it had shaped my self-perception and decision-making in ways I'm still discovering. I'd internalized her criticism and limitations, believing that my career struggles were the result of my own shortcomings rather than her sabotage. I've been working with a therapist to understand how I missed the signs of such extensive manipulation and to develop better boundaries in future relationships. The experience taught me that some people are capable of maintaining elaborate deceptions over years or even decades, especially when those deceptions serve their psychological and professional interests. Christine and I haven't spoken since our confrontation. I heard through mutual contacts that she left Chicago for a position in New York, and I suspect she may have felt that her reputation in our local market was becoming damaged by people who knew about her behavior. Rebuilding my career has been challenging but ultimately rewarding. Without Christine's interference, I've been able to form genuine professional relationships and pursue opportunities based on my actual qualifications rather than her manufactured limitations. I recently landed a senior director position at an agency I dreamed of working for, ironically, one where Christine had previously convinced me I'd never be competitive. The experience taught me that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones who present themselves as friends. Christine's betrayal was more devastating than any professional setback could have been on its own because it involved someone I trusted completely, using that trust to destroy my prospects, while convincing me that my failures were my residuous, own fault. I've learned to pay attention to patterns in my relationships, particularly when someone seems to benefit from my struggles or consistently offers help that doesn't actually materialize into results. True friends celebrate your success without reservation and support your growth without undermining your confidence. Most importantly, I've learned that rebuilding after betrayal is possible, but it requires accepting that some people are capable of deception that goes far beyond what most of us can imagine. The Christine situation taught me to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, even when someone close to me is offering alternative explanations that seem more comfortable to believe. That's the end of that story. Having someone systematically sabotage your life for 8 years while pretending to be your best friend is betrayal on a level that's almost incomprehensible. Our final story shows how family loyalty can blind us to serious problems until it's almost too late. My name is Derek, and I'm 35 years old. For the past 2 years, I've been watching my younger brother destroy his life while lying to everyone who cares about him. What started as brotherly concern has turned into the most difficult moral dilemma I've ever faced, and I'm still not sure I handled it correctly. My brother Jake is 31 and has always been the charmer of our family. Growing up, he was the kid everyone loved, funny, outgoing, naturally talented at sports and academics. Our parents adored him, his teachers praised him, and his friends would do anything for him. Jake had this magnetic personality that made people want to be around him and help him succeed. After college, Jake landed a great job at a consulting firm in Chicago. He was making good money, living in a nice apartment, dating attractive women, and generally living the kind of life that made our parents beam with pride when they talked about their successful son. I live in Minneapolis, about 6 hours away, so I didn't see Jake regularly. But we stayed in close touch through phone calls and text messages, and he seemed to be thriving. He'd tell me about big projects at work, expensive dinners with clients, weekend trips to Vegas with his colleagues. Jake's life sounded exciting and successful, everything you'd want for your younger brother. The first sign that something was wrong came during Christmas 2 years ago. Jake came home for the holidays, and something about him seemed off. He'd always been energetic and talkative, but he seemed manic, talking rapidly about work projects that sounded increasingly grandiose and unrealistic. Jake claimed he was being considered for a major promotion that would make him the youngest director in his firm's history. He talked about deals he was supposedly negotiating that would earn him 6-figure bonuses. He showed us expensive watches and clothes that he said were gifts from grateful clients. Our parents ate it up. They were so proud of Jake's apparent success that they didn't notice how erratic his behavior had become. But I was concerned by how amped up he seemed, how he couldn't sit still, how he'd disappear for hours to take important work calls that seemed to agitate him rather than excite him. After the holidays, Jake's calls became less frequent and more scattered. He'd call me at strange hours, talking rapidly about business opportunities and investment strategies that sounded too good to be true. When I tried to ask practical questions about these ventures, Jake would get defensive and change the subject. By spring, Jake's stories started contradicting each other. He'd tell me about a big client meeting in New York one week, then mention that same client backing out of the deal the following week, then claim the deal was back on but with different terms. Nothing he said seemed to follow a logical progression. The real warning sign came when Jake started asking me for money. It started small. Could I lend him $500 to cover his rent until a client payment came through? Then it was $1,200 for a car repair that couldn't wait for his next paycheck. Then it was $3,000 for what he described as a temporary cash flow problem that would be resolved within a month. Each time, Jake had a reasonable explanation for why he needed the money and a specific plan for paying it back quickly. And each time, I gave him what he asked for because I trusted him and wanted to help. Jake had never been irresponsible with money before, so I assumed he was going through a rough patch that would resolve itself soon. But the requests kept coming, and the amounts kept increasing. Over the course of 8 months, I lent Jake nearly $15,000. None of it was ever repaid, and Jake's explanations for the delays became increasingly elaborate and implausible. Meanwhile, Jake's behavior during our phone conversations was becoming more erratic. He'd call me at 2 in the morning, talking rapidly about business ideas that made no sense. He'd claim he was about to close deals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, then ask me to wire him money for what he described as urgent business expenses. I started asking Jake direct questions about his job, his living situation, his financial circumstances. His answers were evasive and inconsistent, and I began to suspect that something was seriously wrong with either his mental health or his honesty, possibly both. The truth came out when I decided to visit Jake unannounced in Chicago. I was worried about him and wanted to see for myself how he was doing. What I found was devastating. Jake wasn't living in the nice apartment he'd described. He was staying in a weekly rental motel room that was dirty and depressing. He wasn't working at the consulting firm anymore. He'd been fired months earlier for erratic behavior and missing work. The expensive clothes and accessories he'd been showing off were apparently purchased with credit cards that he couldn't pay off. When I confronted Jake with what I'd discovered, he initially tried to maintain his fictional version of events, but eventually he broke down and admitted that his life had been falling apart for over a year. He'd been fired from his job, evicted from his apartment, and had been struggling with what he described as severe anxiety and depression. But there was more to the story. Jake also admitted that he'd been using cocaine regularly for the past 2 years, initially as a way to keep up with the demanding social aspects of his job, but eventually as a daily habit that was consuming most of his income and affecting his work performance. The drug use explained the erratic behavior, the manic phone calls, the financial desperation, and the increasingly unrealistic stories about his professional success. Jake had been using stimulants to maintain the appearance of success, while his real life spiraled out of control. The most heartbreaking part was realizing that Jake had been lying to our entire family for over a year. Our parents still believed he was successful and thriving, calling him regularly for updates on his impressive career and asking me if I thought Jake would ever settle down with a nice girl. Jake begged me not to tell our parents about his real situation. He claimed he was getting clean and looking for a new job, and he promised that he'd be able to get back on track without involving the rest of the family. He said that telling our parents would destroy them and wouldn't help his recovery process. I was torn between wanting to respect Jake's privacy and autonomy as an adult and feeling like our parents deserved to know that their son was struggling with serious problems. Jake was clearly in crisis, but he was also specifically asking me not to betray his confidence. For 3 months, I tried to support Jake's recovery efforts while keeping his secret from our parents. I helped him find a therapist, researched treatment programs, and continued providing financial support for what he claimed were legitimate recovery expenses. But Jake's progress was inconsistent at best. He'd have good weeks where he seemed motivated and clear-headed, followed by relapses into the manic behavior and unrealistic stories that had characterized his decline. The money I was giving him was supposed to be for rent and food, but I suspected much of it was still going to drugs. The breaking point came when Jake called me in the middle of the night, clearly under the influence of something, talking about suicide and how he'd ruined his life beyond repair. He was incoherent and desperate, and I realized that keeping his secret was enabling his continued downward spiral. I called our parents the next morning and told them everything. It was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had, watching them process the fact that their successful son had been lying to them for over a year while battling addiction and mental health issues. Their reaction was exactly what Jake had feared: devastation, guilt, and frantic worry about how they'd failed to notice their son's problems. But it was also what Jake needed: immediate intervention and support from people who loved him unconditionally. Our parents flew to Chicago that same day and essentially staged an intervention. They got Jake into a residential treatment program and provided the kind of comprehensive support that I'd been trying to offer alone for months. Jake was angry at me initially for breaking his confidence and involving our parents. He felt betrayed and claimed that I'd destroyed his chances of recovering quietly and rebuilding his life without family drama. But after several weeks in treatment, he acknowledged that he probably couldn't have gotten clean without more support than I was able to provide. The recovery process has been long and difficult. Jake spent 60 days in residential treatment, followed by several months of outpatient programs and regular therapy. He's been clean for over a year now and has slowly been rebuilding his career and personal relationships. Our family relationships have been complicated by the experience. Our parents struggled with guilt about missing the signs of Jake's addiction and with anger about the lies he'd told them. I've had to work through my own feelings about enabling Jake's problems by providing money and keeping his secrets. Jake and I have rebuilt our relationship, but it's different now. There's less of the easy trust and automatic support that characterized our relationship before his addiction. I love my brother and I'm proud of his recovery, but I'm also more cautious about believing his stories and more direct about asking hard questions when something seems off. The experience taught me that family loyalty sometimes means making decisions that feel like betrayal in the short term, but are necessary for someone's long-term well-being. Keeping Jake's secret felt like protecting him, but it was actually enabling his continued self-destruction. I also learned that addiction is incredibly good at creating elaborate deceptions that can fool even people who know you well. Jake's stories about work success weren't just lies to our parents. They were part of the fantasy he was using to avoid facing the reality of his situation. If you survived this entire journey through the darkest corners of human deception, you've earned yourself a trophy and maybe a long conversation with a therapist about why we're all drawn to this chaos. Thanks for sticking around until the end. And if these tales of betrayal and manipulation made you grateful for the relatively normal drama in your own life, smash that subscribe button for more deep dives into the beautiful disaster that is human behavior. Catch you in the next episode.